The morning Isabella Chin was told she would marry a stranger in a coma, she was measuring medication doses for her patients at Queens General Hospital. Her supervisor pulled her aside with a look that made her stomach drop. "Your father is here," she said quietly. "He's in the lobby with some very important people." Isabella's hands trembled as she removed her gloves. She knew this day would come, the day her family's debts would demand a price she couldn't imagine paying. In the lobby, her father sat hunched between two imposing figures in expensive suits. Across from them, a woman who could only be described as regal surveyed Isabella with calculating eyes. This was Victoria Blackwood, a name that commanded both respect and fear in New York's elite circles. "Miss Chun," Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I have a proposition that will solve all your family's problems. You will marry my son." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella had heard of Alexander Blackwood. Who hadn't? The young CEO who built his own tech empire by 25, whose face graced magazine covers, and whose business acumen was legendary. But she also knew what had happened 6 months ago. The car accident that left him in a coma, fighting for a life that might never return. He's unconscious," Isabella whispered, the absurdity of the situation making her head spin. "Which is precisely why I need someone I can trust," Victoria continued, her fingers drumming against her designer purse. "Someone with medical knowledge, someone who understands sacrifice. Your father owes us $300,000. Marry my son, care for him, and the debt disappears. Refuse, and your family loses everything tomorrow." The choice that wasn't really a choice at all settled over Isabella's shoulders like a lead blanket. The next 3 days passed in a blur of legal documents and preparations. Isabella found herself standing before mirrors in wedding boutiques, trying on dresses for a ceremony that felt more like a funeral. Her younger sister, Lily, tried to be supportive, but Isabella could see the pity in her eyes. Her father couldn't even look at her, the weight of his failed business ventures having led to selling his daughter's future. Her mother had passed away years ago, and Isabella couldn't help but feel grateful she wasn't here to witness this. The Blackwood mansion stood like a fortress on the Upper East Side, all marble and crystal and cold perfection. Isabella was given a tour by the head housekeeper, Mrs. Potter, a kind woman who seemed to be the only source of warmth in the entire estate. "Mr. Alexander's room is on the 3rd floor," she explained, leading Isabella through hallways lined with priceless art. "He receives round-the-clock medical care. You'll have your own suite adjacent to his." The first time Isabella saw Alexander, her breath caught in her throat. Even in his unconscious state, he was devastatingly handsome. Dark hair fell across his forehead, his features sharp and aristocratic. Machines beeped steadily around him, monitoring the life that hung by such delicate threads. She found herself studying his face, wondering who he had been before the accident, what thoughts and dreams lay trapped behind those closed eyelids. Victoria's visits were brief and businesslike. She spoke to her son as if he could hear her, updating him on company matters, never betraying a hint of maternal warmth. "The board is getting restless," she would say. "They want to vote in Marcus as interim CEO. But I won't let them push you aside, not while there's still hope." Isabella began to understand that this marriage was as much about protecting Alexander's position as it was about continuing the family line. The wedding day dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself mourned the occasion. Isabella stood in the hospital chapel wearing a simple white dress, her hair pulled back in elegant bun that the Blackwood family stylist had insisted upon. The guest list was small, just immediate family and a few key board members who needed to witness the legitimacy of the union. Her father gave her away with tears in his eyes, whether from shame or relief, she couldn't tell. The ceremony felt surreal. Isabella stood beside Alexander's hospital bed, which had been wheeled into the chapel for the occasion. The priest spoke words about love and commitment that seemed to mock the very nature of their arrangement. When it came time for the vows, Isabella spoke them to a man who couldn't hear, promised to cherish someone she didn't know. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of his heart monitor and the scratch of pens on the marriage certificate. "You may kiss the groom," the priest said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the unconventional ceremony. Isabella leaned down, her white dress rustling against the hospital bed rails. She meant to simply brush her lips against his forehead, a gesture to complete the charade. But as she bent close, she caught the faint scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine that seemed at odds with the sterile hospital smell. Her lips had barely touched the skin when she felt it, a flutter of movement beneath her hand where it rested on his arm. She pulled back, heart racing, and watched in disbelief as Alexander's fingers twitched. Then his whole hand moved, grasping weakly at the air. The chapel erupted in chaos as his eyelids began to flutter, and then impossibly they opened. Blue eyes, the color of a winter storm, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. "Ooh." His voice was hoarse from months of silence. Barely a whisper, but it might as well have been a shout for the reaction it caused. Victoria rushed forward, pushing Isabella aside in her haste to reach her son. Doctors flooded the chapel, instruments appearing from nowhere as they checked his vitals, shone lights in his eyes, asked him questions he was too disoriented to answer. Through it all, his gaze kept finding Isabella, confusion and something else, curiosity, written across his features. The next hours were a whirlwind of medical tests and evaluations. The media somehow got wind of the miracle, and soon the hospital was swarmed with reporters. "Billionaire wakes from coma on wedding day," screamed the headlines. Isabella found herself relegated to a corner, the forgotten bride in a designer dress, watching as the Blackwood machine sprang into action to control the narrative. It wasn't until late that evening that she was finally allowed to see him. Alexander was propped up in bed, looking more alert but still fragile. His mother sat beside him, filling him in on 6 months of missed life. When Isabella entered, Victoria's expression soured. "This is Isabella," she said crisply. "Your wife." The words hung between them like a challenge. Alexander studied her with those penetrating eyes, taking in every detail. "I don't remember agreeing to a wedding," he said finally, his voice stronger now but laced with suspicion. Victoria launched into an explanation about protecting his interests, about the board's attempts to remove him, about necessary measures. Isabella watched his face harden with each word, saw the moment he understood he'd been married off while helpless. "Get out," he said quietly, but with a force that made Victoria flinch. "Both of you. Get out." His mother tried to protest, but the monitors began beeping faster, his agitation clear. The nurses ushered them out, and Isabella found herself in the hallway, still in her wedding dress, officially married to a man who looked at her like she was the enemy. The following days established a pattern. Alexander underwent intensive physical therapy, his determination to regain his strength almost frightening in its intensity. He refused to see Isabella, communicating only through lawyers who made it clear he wanted the marriage annulled immediately. But Victoria held firm. The contracts were ironclad. The marriage couldn't be dissolved for at least a year without significant financial penalties that would jeopardize his position in the company. Isabella moved into the suite adjacent to his, as originally planned, but it felt like living in exile. She could hear him sometimes through the walls. Frustrated grunts during therapy, low conversations with his secretary as he tried to catch up on 6 months of business. She continued her shifts at the hospital, grateful for the escape, but the whispers followed her everywhere. Everyone knew she was the woman who married Alexander Blackwood while he slept. 2 weeks after he woke, Isabella found him collapsed in the hallway at 3 a.m. He'd been trying to walk to the kitchen unaided, his pride preventing him from calling for help. As she knelt beside him, checking his pulse with professional efficiency, he grabbed her wrist. "Why?" he asked, his vulnerability in that moment stripping away all pretense. "Why did you agree to this?" For the first time, Isabella told him the truth about her father's debts, about the threats to her family, about the choice that wasn't really a choice. She expected anger, more suspicion, but instead, something shifted in his expression. "So we're both prisoners," he said quietly, just in different ways. She helped him back to his room, and for the first time since he woke, he didn't push her away. The dynamics began to change after that night. Alexander still kept his distance, but the hostility faded into something more like cautious observation. He allowed her to assist with his medical care, recognizing her expertise. During one particularly difficult therapy session, when his legs refused to cooperate and frustration brought him close to tears, Isabella was the one who talked him through it, sharing stories of other patients who'd recovered from similar injuries. "You were a nurse before." He gestured vaguely at their situation. "Why did you want to become a doctor?" he asked one evening as she helped with his exercises. Isabella found herself opening up about her mother's death from a treatable disease, about wanting to help people who couldn't afford quality health care. He listened with an intensity that made her self-conscious, as if he was reassembling his understanding of who she was. The mansion began to feel less like a prison as Alexander's recovery progressed. He started joining her for meals, their conversations evolving from stilted exchanges to genuine discussions. She discovered his dry sense of humor, his passion for technology that went beyond mere business. He learned about her love of classical music, her ability to diagnose conditions from the smallest symptoms, her dreams that had been put on hold. 1 month after waking, Alexander returned to his office for the first time. Isabella watched from the doorway as he sat behind his desk, hands shaking slightly as he reviewed the stack of documents his secretary had prepared. "The company's lost 12% of its value," he said, not looking up. "Marcus has been busy." The name sent a chill down Isabella's spine. She'd heard it whispered in the halls. Victoria's nephew who'd been gunning for Alexander's position. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. Isabella found him in his study at 2 a.m., surrounded by financial reports and personnel files. "Something's wrong," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "The numbers don't add up. The accident report doesn't make sense. And Marcus..." He trailed off, but Isabella could see the suspicion growing in his eyes. She sat beside him, and together they began piecing together the puzzle. The pattern emerged slowly. Transfers authorized just days before the accident. Contracts redirected to companies Marcus had connections with. Security footage from the night of the accident mysteriously corrupted. "He tried to kill me," Alexander said, the words hanging heavy in the darkness. "My own cousin tried to kill me." The betrayal in his voice made Isabella's heart ache. As they dug deeper into Marcus's deceptions, the danger became real. Strange cars began following Isabella to work. Her locker at the hospital was broken into, though nothing was taken. Alexander hired security, but the threat felt like a noose tightening around them. Through it all, their partnership deepened. Late nights spent reviewing documents turned into conversations about everything and nothing. The space between them, once filled with suspicion and resentment, began to fill with something else entirely. The moment Isabella realized she was falling in love with her husband came unexpectedly. He was practicing walking without his cane, determined to appear strong at the upcoming board meeting. He stumbled, and without thinking, she caught him, their faces inches apart. "I've got you," she whispered, and the look in his eyes told her he understood she meant more than just in that moment. "If you believe that love can bloom where no one expects, maybe it's time to join us on this journey." But Marcus was growing desperate. The board meeting was in 3 days, and if Alexander appeared fully recovered, Marcus's hopes of taking control would evaporate. The security team intercepted a threat. If Alexander showed up to that meeting, neither he nor his gold-digger wife would leave alive. Victoria wanted to postpone, but Alexander refused. "I won't let him win," he said, his jaw set with determination. The night before the board meeting, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She found Alexander on the terrace, looking out over the city lights. "You could let him have it," she said quietly. "The company, the money, all of it, we could start over somewhere else." She hadn't meant to say we, but the word hung between them like a promise. Alexander turned to her, and for the first time since waking, he smiled, really smiled. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "To run away with me?" The question was loaded with possibilities, with futures they hadn't dared imagine. Before she could answer, he pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste touch that had woken him. This was fire and promise, and the acknowledgement of everything growing between them. The board meeting arrived with the weight of a storm. Alexander entered the boardroom with Isabella at his side, no longer hiding behind a cane, projecting the strength and confidence that had built his empire. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. As Alexander presented evidence of the embezzlement, of the sabotage, of the attempted murder, the room grew deathly quiet. "These are serious accusations," one board member ventured. Marcus laughed, a sound without humor. "Accusations from a man who was in a coma, influenced by a woman who married him for money. Who's to say what's real and what's fantasy?" The words were calculated to hurt, to discredit, but Alexander remained steady. He'd anticipated this. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was Isabella. She stood, producing a flash drive from her pocket. "3 weeks ago, Mr. Blackwood received a call from you, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You didn't know he'd started recording all his calls after discovering the discrepancies. Would you like the board to hear what you said when you thought no one was listening?" The recording played Marcus's voice, dripping with venom and confession. The room erupted as security moved in, but Marcus was faster. A gun appeared in his hand, pointed directly at Alexander. "You should have stayed asleep," he snarled. Time seemed to slow as Isabella moved on instinct, stepping between them just as Marcus pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed her shoulder, sending her spinning into Alexander's arms. Chaos erupted as security tackled Marcus, the gun skittering across the polished floor. Alexander held Isabella, his hands coming away bloody, his face a mask of terror. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do that? Would you have done the same? I'd love to know what you think." Because Isabella managed, pain making her vision blur, somewhere between the contract and now. "I fell in love with you. Real love, the kind worth taking a bullet for." The ambulance ride was a blur of Alexander refusing to let go of her hand, of him commanding the best doctors, of promises whispered against her hair that everything would be okay. The surgery was successful, the wound clean. Isabella woke to find Alexander beside her bed, looking haggard but relieved. "Marcus is in custody," he said immediately. "He's confessed everything. The company is safe." But she could see in his eyes that wasn't what mattered to him anymore. "You scared me," he admitted. "I've faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar deals, but nothing has ever terrified me like almost losing you." The recovery was different this time. Now it was Alexander's turn to be the caregiver, to help with exercises, to share stories that made the painful days bearable. He moved her things into his room without asking, as if the idea of distance between them was no longer acceptable. The contract that had brought them together lay forgotten in some lawyer's filing cabinet, irrelevant compared to what they'd built. 3 months later, on a warm spring evening, Alexander led Isabella back to the hospital chapel where it all began. But this time, it was filled with friends and family who'd watched their unlikely love story unfold. Her father wept openly, finally able to look his daughter in the eye. Victoria, softened by near tragedy, actually smiled. Lily served as maid of honor, beaming with joy for her sister. "The first time we stood here," Alexander said, holding Isabella's hands, "I was asleep. You woke me up in more ways than one. You showed me that life isn't about contracts and leveraging advantages. It's about finding someone who will stand between you and a bullet, who will hold your hand through the darkest nights, who will see past your walls to the person you're afraid to be." We have more stories like this coming, so don't forget to hit the like button and turn on notifications. Isabella squeezed his hands, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me the courage to be more than I ever thought I could be. You turned an arrangement into an adventure, a contract into a commitment I choose every single day. I was forced to marry a stranger, but I'm choosing to spend my life with my best friend, my partner, my love." This time, when the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," Alexander swept Isabella into his arms, their kiss a celebration of everything they'd overcome. The chapel erupted in applause, but for them, the world had narrowed to just this moment, just this choice, just this love that had grown in the most unlikely circumstances. 1 year later, Isabella graduated from medical school at the top of her class, with Alexander cheering the loudest from the audience. She joined his company's foundation, heading an initiative to provide free health care to underserved communities. Their love story became legend in both the business and medical worlds, proof that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. They would tell their children years later about how their parents met, about the sleeping prince and the reluctant bride, about bullets and betrayal and choosing love over fear. But what they emphasized most was that true love isn't about perfect beginnings or fairy tale meetings. It's about two people choosing each other again and again, through comas and contracts, through bullets and board meetings, through every challenge life throws their way. As for Marcus, he served his time, his greed having cost him everything. The Blackwood Empire flourished under Alexander's renewed leadership, but more importantly, the cold mansion became a warm home, filled with laughter and love and the kind of happiness that money can't buy. Because in the end, Isabella hadn't just married a CEO in a coma. She found her soulmate, and he'd found his salvation. Their story reminds us that love doesn't follow scripts or contracts. It writes its own terms, creates its own miracles, and sometimes, just sometimes, it begins with a kiss that changes everything. A kiss that wakes not just a sleeping body, but two sleeping souls who didn't know they were waiting for each other all along. And that, perhaps, is the greatest miracle of all, that in a world of arranged marriages and business deals, true love still finds a way to triumph. Every morning, Alexander would wake beside Isabella and marvel at the journey that brought them together. And every morning, she would smile and remind him, "You're awake," not just from the coma, but from a life half-lived, from a world where love was a business transaction. Together, they were fully, brilliantly, miraculously awake. And that made all the difference.